Hello everyone, it's Conrad Fisher, and here's one of the easiest sections we have. It's thyroid. Now, unlike Cushing's disease and unlike the adrenal, thyroid has only one main enzyme, thyroperoxidase. It has no numbers in it. It does three different pathways. Wow, you got one enzyme with no numbers doing almost everything. Isn't that fantastic? You're going to like it. The only place in the body that uses iodide, and if people use the word iodide and iodine interchangeably, it doesn't really matter. It's a trap into the thyroid gland that gets pumped in. And the thyroid follicles, like little blisters, little vesicles of thyroid hormone, which stays inside the thyroid till it's necessary to be used. Kind of like microwave cooking. It's like a lean cuisine that stays in your thyroid forever. And the thyroid follicle cells, the lining, synthesize T4 and T3. They synthesize T4 at a rate of 20 to 1 with T3, and then eventually the level becomes even 50 to 1 because T3 has a shorter half-life. Colloidal storage of iodide is the word for storage on proteins. That's what colloidal storage means. Iodinated tyrosines. You like that? The iodinated tyrosines of thyroglobulin. Yay! And so what that means is that this is the only steroid hormone that's not made from cholesterol. It's made from individual amino acids. Well, this shows you that the thyroid is mostly goo-filled, mostly colloid. Colloid is the storage globulin of proteins that has all the thyroid hormone on top of it. And it just stays there. So you can make a juice of thyroid. You can go to Jamba Juice and say, I'd like a thyroid smoothie, please. Tasty. Thyroid hormone synthesis is very easy. First of all, you notice that the iodide goes in. Let's look at the bottom left. The iodide goes in. And thyroperoxidase makes you lose that negative charge, TPO. Thyroid peroxidase. Oxidation is the loss of electrons. So you oxidize it, it loses electrons. And it makes it available to bind to tyrosines. You see, if it's not oxidized, there will be no room in the orbit of the iodide for it to bind the tyrosines. There's only room in the orbit to bind the tyrosines because you've oxidized off an electron. There's only room to bind the tyrosines because you've oxidized off the electrons. So you oxidize off the electrons, and then you're able to hook it up with one iodine. And now these are finally the kinds of numbers a medical student can relate to. 1 plus 2, 2 plus 2. A monoiodotyrosine, a diiodotyrosine, 1 plus 2 equals 3. And 2 diiodotyrosines, 2 plus 2 equal 4. And you have one enzyme metabolizing all of it. Isn't that fantastic? But remember that free iodine is not very useful. The body doesn't like these free elements. They're damaging. The same way your body doesn't like free iron. Free iron is very damaging to tissues. Free iron is damaging to tissues. So that's why when we have free iron, it's got to be hooked up with myoglobin and hemoglobin so it doesn't damage you. And when you have free zinc or copper, free copper is Wilson's disease. Free iron is hemochromatosis and hemosiderosis. So you've got to make it organic with something that's like a tyrosine or an amino acid to make it useful. Now, thyroid function is directly proportional to iodide uptake. The more you take up iodide, the more the thyroid functions. It's like revving your engine. I don't think it's that complicated. See, here's the great thing about thyroid hormone. Here we're into this section 5 minutes, and we're already repeating ourselves. Iodine is picked up at a co-transporter symport with sodium. The iodide is oxidized by peroxidase. The iodide is coupled up with tyrosine and mono and diiodotyrosenes. The mono and diiodotyrosenes get coupled up as T3s and T4s. They get stored on thyroglobulin and colloid. Okay, the thyroglobulin is the storage form, like all of the proteins. It's synthesized on ribosomes. Then you could be cute and in the next section say, oh no, it's really on endoplasmic reticulum. That's fine. Glycosylated in endoplasmic reticulum. Just a spoonful of sugar makes reticulum go down. And packaged in the Golgi. And it enters the lumen from exocytosis. And there it stays for months until you're ready. Welcome to thyroid hormone synthesis. It's easy. Thyroperoxidase is at the apical border of the follicular cells. It makes it oxidize. Isn't that a great name? That's why we call it thyroperoxidase, because it oxidizes things. And oxidation means to lose electrons. And it makes you also couples up the T3s and the T4s. The iodination of it hangs out on thyroglobulin, and the tyrosine residues end up being recycled, and you get mono and diiodotyrosenes, and DIT, the diiodotyrosin, is the predominant form because you make more T4 than T3. I want you to think of T4 really as a pre-hormone for T3. T4 hangs around mostly, and then as the tissues need more energy or function, they convert it to T3. That's pretty logical. Coupling means the T4s are produced. Coupling means the diiodotyrosenes and the mono or diiodotyrosine are hooked up together. Now the excess ones, the ones that are not used, of the mono and diiodotyrosine, hang around there waiting to be hooked up again in the next cycle. Kind of like unmatched socks in the laundry. You don't throw them out. No, you don't. You leave those socks there saying, right now this sock is all alone, but someday its right partner will come. Right now it's a socky all alone. But we don't throw them all around because you're saying someday the sock will come. The same with the unused mono and diiodotyrosenes. So when you got a lot of iodine, you make T4. We take for granted that iodine deficiency used to be really, really common because all of our food is supplemented like crazy. That wasn't always true. Goiter used to be common. And when iodine is scarce, T3 is produced. No big deal. No big deal. You know, you got a couple of months storage in the colloid. And remember, colloid just means storage form of thyroid hormone in the thyroid gland. That's all. So these pictures just show you that there's T4 has surprisingly 4 iodine molecules, and T3 and reverse T3 have surprisingly 3 iodide molecules. And only difference between T3, which is very active, and reverse T3, which is completely inactive, is just the location of where the iodide is on the molecule. Now, it's going to show you this because we want you to see that it's incredibly similar, and that the only difference is just this little thing about thyroid iodide location. So it's not that you're going to be asked to draw this structure. It's that you will just have to know that the only difference between T3 and reverse T3 is the location of where the iodide is removed. That's the only difference between T3 and reverse T3, the location of the iodides. Now, iodide is never left free. It's coupled up. And it hangs out there, coupled up with tyrosine on thyroglobulin, until your TSH from the pituitary goes down to the thyroid and knocks on the door and says, hello, Mr. Thyroid, may I have a cup of thyroid hormone, please? And would you lyse me some? And you see here it says a lysosome, right? Lyse me some. And then it melts off the T3 and the T4, and they go out into circulation in a 20-to-1 ratio. T3 and T4 go out into circulation in a 20-to-1 ratio. Eventually, it becomes 50-to-1 because T3 has a shorter half-life. Free thyroid hormone is only about 1%. When you're pregnant, estrogens increase thyroid binding globulin. So does it raise the total or the free? It raises the total, but not the free. Why is it that the T4 eventually has a much higher level, 50-to-1? Because the T3 has a shorter half-life. So it's not so much that the T4 goes up, it's that the T3 goes down. Thyroglobulin is the storage form inside the thyroid follicle. Thyroid binding globulin is the transport protein. Binding globulin means a transport protein. Thyroid hormones get lysed out of the thyroid gland, and T3 and 4 bind to the same nuclear receptor, but T3 does it with much greater affinity, which is very simple. Why? The T4 is bound to thyroid binding globulin, and T3 is free. So how can T4 bind to the nuclear receptor when it's outside in the car? It's riding around in the car outside called thyroid binding globulin. So how do you expect it to go inside and bind the nucleus when you're hanging out in the car? T3 is more active. That's why T4 is a pre-hormone for T3, and you either get the very active T3 or the completely inactive reverse T3. And most circulating T3 is not from fresh making, it is from peripheral conversion. And that has significance because one of the medications we use when you have thyroid storm, acute hyperthyroidism, is you use medications like propylthiouracil and methimazole, steroids that all block peripheral conversion. It's hard for people to understand that. You see, if you have very severe hyperthyroidism, giving methimazole and propylthiouracil to block the production of the hormone is good, but blocking peripheral conversion is gooder because it blocks the effect faster. This image is a representation of the major product of the thyroid gland, which is T4. The word T4 and thyroxine are synonymous terms. Now, based on whether or not you're removing it from the 5' site or the 5' site, you are making the T3 or the reverse T3. So knowing that there is a difference in the location of where the thyroid hormone is removed, where it has its iodine removed from the thyroid hormone, it is important for you to understand the concept of peripheral conversion, making it active or inactive. T4 is protein bound more often, so T4 has a longer half-life, so T4 has less effect, so T4 is less into the urine, and I just said the same thing 4 different ways. Longer half-life, more protein bound, less effect, and less into the urine of T4. T3 is less protein bound and goes into the urine much more. The reason that thyroid hormone is such an easy chapter is that thyroid hormone always pushes in the same direction, doesn't it now? It increases the speed and the velocity and the utilization of energy. It increases the metabolic rate. It increases the heart rate. It increases heat production. It increases O2 consumption, heat production. It uses up lipids. It uses up glucose. Thyroid hormone makes your heart beat faster, your blood pressure go up. It makes your bowels go faster, and if it's not diarrhea, it's at least more frequent. It's more like tachypoopia. And thyroid hormone is why we have our body temperature is never room temperature. It's above that. It increases sodium, potassium, ATPase. It controls the metabolic furnace of the body, which is the mitochondria. And that's why thyroid hormone can last for days and days, because it takes days for that peripheral conversion to make it go away. Now, the only two things that are important here that are exceptions is that the mature brain does not need thyroid hormone for its metabolic activity. It's hard for people to understand that. You need thyroid hormone to produce the brain, but you don't need thyroid hormone for the metabolic activity of the adult brain. And that's hard for people to understand sometimes. You need thyroid hormone to make the brain. In other words, if you don't have thyroid hormone, by the time you're a few months old, you have permanent neurological damage. You need thyroid hormone to make the brain, but not for the metabolic activity of the mature brain. And the uterus is exempt from metabolic control as well from thyroid hormone. Everything else is under the control of thyroid hormone for metabolic activity. The other thing is you need thyroid hormone for growth hormone to be released. If you don't have thyroid hormone, you don't have the permissive effect of growth hormone being released as well. Now, although fetal growth is normal, once you're born, you need to have thyroid hormone for the brain to be developed. That's cretinism, a blank brain. It's like celiac disease of your frontal lobes. Things go in, but it slides right through and they're not absorbed. If you don't have thyroid hormone, the brain is not formed. Well, it's understandable that there's an effect on lipids and carbohydrates of thyroid hormone. After all, if thyroid hormone drives the metabolic activity of the brain, if you don't have thyroid hormone, you don't have the utilization of these substrates. If thyroid hormone drives the metabolic activity of every place except the brain, if you don't use up the fuels, they build up. If you don't use up the fuels, you get hyperlipidemic and hyperglycemic. Now, when I was in medical school, I used to have to memorize that as a fact. Hypothyroidism, high lipids, hypothyroidism, high lipids, hypothyroidism, high lipids, a pain in the ass. It's rather to say, well, if you keep filling up the car but you don't drive it, doesn't the gas spill over the side? Yes, it does. If you keep buying food but you don't eat it, doesn't the food build up? Yes, it does. So the lipids build up because you can't use them without the thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones are needed and use up fuels. So that's why lipids and carbohydrates build up and you get hyperlipidemia and glucose intolerance when you have hypothyroidism. Thyroid hormone increases both the speed and the force of contraction of the heart. It increases contractility by increasing the affinity of beta receptors, and it's a direct stimulatory effect on the SA node, so that's why it speeds up the heart rate. It also explains why there's bradycardia in hypothyroid people, because if thyroid hormone speeds up the heart rate and speeds up contractility, no thyroid hormone decreases contractility, decreases the heart rate. So thyroid hormone increases the cardiac output, increases systolic pressure and stroke volume, and that's why also you have to have thyroid hormone to have the right sodium potassium ATPase throughout the body. Now, this is not just for the heart that you need this for sodium potassium ATPase. This happens everywhere. So sodium potassium ATPase effect is something that's routine throughout the entire body, with the exception of the adult brain and the uterus. It's the adult brain and the uterus that are the only exceptions for metabolic activity. Thyroid hormone also makes you breathe faster because you've got to maintain the ventilatory activity to the amount of oxygen used. Thyroid hormone also increases erythropoietin because there's a thyroid hormone receptor on people's bone marrow. And that's why it is that thyroid hormone, you end up getting anemic also if you don't have thyroid hormone. Hypothyroidism causes anemia. And when you don't have thyroid hormone, you get constipated because thyroid hormone increases gut mobility. Now, it has an effect on bone turnover, and that's why hyperthyroidism causes osteoporosis, because hyperthyroidism consumes the bone. Now, hypothyroidism increases prolactin, because when you have a low thyroid hormone, you have an increased thyrotropin-releasing hormone. And thyrotropin-releasing hormone can directly stimulate prolactin when it's at pathologic amounts. Remember, it only stimulates prolactin at pathological amounts, not at normal amounts. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone will stimulate prolactin, but only at pathologically elevated amounts. Thyroid hormone is under the control of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus makes the hypotropin-releasing hormone. Goes down that portal system, down into the anterior pituitary, and tickles the thyrotropes into making thyroid-stimulating hormone. And the thyroid-stimulating hormone goes into the blood and tickles that thyroid gland into making T4 and T3. And that's why it's called a hormone in the endocrine system, because even though it may not be nearby, it still goes into the blood. Now, the fastest of the TSH effects is that it increases in minutes or an hour all the steps and synthesis of thyroid hormones. The iodide trapping, remember, sodium and iodide, sodium and iodide, sodium and iodide, thyroglobulin synthesis off those ribosomes, including glycosylation in the endoplasmic reticulum. And it hangs out there in the lumen of the thyroid follicle, in the lumen of the thyroid follicles. And it hangs out there until it needs to be used. And it also stimulates the release of T4 into the blood, the same way it takes the vesicle of preformed colloid and gland and hormone and just pinches off a little bit and sends it off into circulation. Now, not all the effects of TSH will happen instantly. There are slower effects, such as increasing the blood flow to the thyroid gland. That's slower, such as actually making the thyroid cells grow. You don't get instant growth of thyroid cells over hours. It takes a while. So the immediate effect, the fast effect, is to release what's already there. Synthesize a little more gland, a little more hormone, and release what's there. That happens fast. But the effects on growing the gland, that's slow. If you're stranded on a desert island and you can only order one thyroid hormone test, get the TSH. The TSH starts you on telling it where everything is a problem. Thyroid gland functioning is based on TSH. If you have hypothyroidism, that TSH will be up. If you have hyperthyroidism, generally the TSH is down. Now, free T4 is good to help determine the activity of the thyroid hormone, but TSH tells you all the pathology. It's very hard to know about thyroperoxidase antibodies. Sometimes they're useful if you have a person that's got hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, and you can't make a diagnosis off the glands, off the enzymes, off the hormones, and you can tell if you've got an autoimmune disease. Hashimoto's thyroiditis is the origin of most hypothyroidism. Most hypothyroidism is in fact burnt out Hashimoto's thyroiditis. In other words, it showed up as a thyroiditis that you didn't feel, and then the gland goes away and it becomes like postmenopausal. Thyroperoxidase antibodies are okay for Graves' disease. More precise term may be thyroid-stimulating immunoglobulin, because Graves' disease is from an immunoglobulin that switches on the thyroid in the on position. It's an antibody that acts like thyroid-stimulating hormone. It's a TSH-type antibody. The tests of thyroid function, looking at thyroid iodide uptake scans, is a way of telling, is this a hyperfunctioning gland? Subacute thyroiditis is not hyperfunctioning. The gland has been attacked by antibodies, and it's literally just leaking thyroid hormone. It's just leaking thyroid hormone. So it's not that it's overproducing. It's that the gland is being attacked by antibodies so that the walls of it are leaking off the antibody, leaking off the hormone. Graves' disease is different. That is an over-functioning gland. That distinctly has the highest iodide uptake. Now you might say, how do you have the iodide uptake as both therapeutic, radioactive iodide as therapeutic, ablating the gland, and radioactive iodine as a test? Well, the answer is very simple. There's radiation that's used for a CAT scan of the head, and there's radiation that you may use to ablate brain tumors. There's just different isotopes. Subacute thyroiditis and silent thyroiditis are just leaking glands. But Graves' disease is an overfunctioning gland from a thyroid-stimulating immunoglobulin. A thyroid-stimulating immunoglobulin. Toxic adenomas are intermittent, meaning there's just patchy uptake. Toxic adenomas are hyperfunctioning, but only in the spot where there's an adenoma. A toxic multinodular goiter is an enlarged gland throughout and has multiple areas of high uptake, kind of like having lots of toxic adenomas.